Should you only study languages when you feel like it, or should you force yourself to do it even when you don't feel like it in the moment? It's an interesting question, and I think one of the reasons it's interesting is because it has a bunch of different answers. Everyone seems to disagree on what the actual right thing to do is. And just to be clear, when I say don't feel like it, I mean you've set yourself the goal of learning a language, say it's Italian, for example, and then one day, this is very common, you just don't feel like studying, for example. You know that your daily habit is flashcards, as just an example of what it might be, and you don't feel like doing it. So should you do the thing that you don't feel like doing and potentially improve towards the language, or should you take the day off and do what you feel like doing in the moment and maybe sacrifice a little bit of your long-term goal? Instead of answering it directly, I'm just going to explain the concept of motivation in a way that I think most people don't explain it, which is why a lot of people don't make a lot of progress in goals they set, because this is really, really important to understand. So, the way motivation works is, if I asked you what motivation was, you'd probably tell me it's like, oh, what do you feel like doing? And that's not incorrect, but it's also a level one answer. It's not particularly sophisticated, and it's also not particularly useful, because obviously motivation is the reason we do anything. Like, there has to be some kind of motivation. There has to be some motivation for me to make this video. I do feel like making it, but even if I didn't, there's the fact that I'm going to post it and people will watch it. That would be the motivation. So what actually is motivation? There's two real types of motivation. I don't think there's a third. From my looking at it, I've only identified two, and that's short-term and long-term motivation, and they're quite different actually. So short-term motivation is the motivation you probably think about when you hear the word motivation, how you define it. It's basically what you emotionally feel like doing in the moment, and you might feel like one day you might feel like doing language learning, the next day you might not. You might feel like doing something that's bad for you, but you feel like doing it, like eating junk food, for example, etc. So it's just what you emotionally feel like. You've very little control over it. And then the other type of motivation is long-term motivation, and it's very different from short-term motivation in that it's not what you emotionally feel like in the moment. It's your long-term desires and goals, not it's the things you actually want to happen long term. So although you feel like them, you desire them, oftentimes it's a very powerful desire, way more powerful than short term motivation. But these are the things that you actually want to achieve. So for example, it might be learning a specific language. It could be doing X, Y, and Z. Something that's not gonna, it's something that you don't emotionally feel like doing right now. It's just a goal you're working towards. For example, when you do study a language, you're not doing flashcards so that you can immediately speak the language straight away. You're doing that because of long-term motivation, so that you can become better at the thing that you want to be better at. The problem is what I call asymmetry of motivation. So two types of motivation, right? We agree on that. I've explained that to you. The problem is they don't always match, and that's what I call asymmetry of motivation. So I'll put it into an example so that you can understand. Short-term motivation, long-term motivation. In the long term, you want to learn French, for example, as a language. You want to become fluent in French. However, in the short term, what you feel like doing right now is not what's going to get you towards that goal. You don't feel like doing flashcards. You set yourself the goal today of doing some flashcards in French to become a little bit better at French. And over time, if you kept doing that, you'd become a lot better at French. But the problem is you don't have the short-term motivation to do that today. You don't feel like doing flashcards. There's an asymmetry, because if you obey your short-term motivation, you're not going to make progress towards your long-term motivation. Obviously, it's not going to sink the ship of you learning French. It's not like if you don't do flashcards today, you're going to explode and never learn French. But it is going to set you back. If you did do the flashcards today, you'd obviously be better towards your long-term goal. And if you obey your long-term motivation, you'd be disobeying your short-term motivation, and you'd have to force yourself to do something that you don't actually feel like doing in the moment. And this is where the controversy arises. All of the controversy and the people disagreeing is in this asymmetry of motivation, in that what should you do when your long-term and short-term motivation don't match. And I think I have the answer, and I think if you're the kind of person that is anything like me, I think you also have the answer. And that's, why on earth would you disobey your long-term motivation for your short-term motivation? It doesn't make any sense to me. That there is basically no reason ever why you should obey your short-term motivation over your long-term motivation. And I'll tell you why. If you decide to obey your long-term motivation. So for example, we'll say you don't, obviously, I'll just get this out of the way real quick. Obviously there are plenty of days, some days, depending on how motivated you are, where your short-term and long-term motivation match up. You feel like doing some language learning and you also want to learn the language. So fantastic. It's easy to do that. That's a fun day, but not all the time, obviously. Sometimes you just don't feel like doing stuff. And what happens is if you decide to obey your long-term motivation anyway, and you show what's called discipline, which we'll talk more about that in a second. If you choose to show discipline and actually make progress towards your long-term goal, even though you don't particularly feel like doing anything, what's going to happen is, although it might not be hugely fun in the moment, it probably will get a little bit better as you push through. But although you might not feel particularly motivated to do anything right now, you're not actually doing it for you right now. You're not actually doing the language learning. The benefit of the thing you're doing is not for you. It's for your future self. You're actually working for your future self. And what's going to happen in the future, regardless of whether you decide to do the work or not, you're not going to remember what the work was like. All you're going to be left with is the result. And the result is either going to be the fact that you didn't actually make any progress, or you did actually make any progress. I want you to think back to the time when, just pick a random time where you knew you should have done some flashcards, you knew you should have done something in the language you were learning, and you chose not to do it. You chose to be lazy just because you didn't feel like doing it. Do you actually feel happy that you did that? Was it worth avoiding a little bit of discomfort, or do you wish that your past self had actually done the work that he or she didn't feel like doing, and then in doing so would have made you a better, more proficient speaker of the language you're learning? Or that's probably what you want, right? If you could look back at your past self and yell something, you wouldn't be happy that they were slacking off and not doing the thing required, because they're not working for themselves. That reward is yours. Now kind of flip the tables and imagine your past self did do the work. You know that you didn't feel like doing flashcards, but you did the flashcards anyway, and as a result, you don't really remember the difficulty, you don't really remember the frustration, it kind of vanishes. But what you are left with is the fact that you are 1% better at the language. You are, every day that you did the flashcards or you did the reading or whatever, when you didn't feel like doing it, actually made you a better speaker of the language. And you can actually look back at yourself in the past with some level of gratitude, thinking he or she didn't feel like doing that, but they did it anyway, and I'm better off for it. They weren't working for themselves. That person that was me in the past was working for me now, and I'm very grateful for the actions I have taken to be better. So if you are anything like me, you know the answer is 100% you should not do the things that you know you're supposed to do when you don't feel like it. If you set yourself the daily habit of every single day, I'm going to do this deck of flashcards this week, and then I'll do a different one next week, but every day I'm going to do flashcards, and one day you just don't feel like it, you just don't feel like doing it, it doesn't matter, because you're not doing it for yourself. Your long-term motivation hasn't changed. You're never going to lose your long-term motivation. You might feel like not doing something in the moment, but it's not like you just don't actually want to know the language. You don't want to do any actual work at the moment, but you still want to be able to speak the language. And once you start missing days, you will lose confidence and you'll look back at yourself and not be happy. Whereas if you do actually push through it and you do all the things required to make your future self better, you'll have nothing but confidence and gratitude and proficiency in the things that you truly wanted. So yeah, that's just a little video on motivation and should you actually do the things that you don't feel like doing. I will address one criticism, as I said I would before when I mentioned I'd talk about discipline. A lot of people do think it's kind of toxic to force yourself to do things you don't want to do. That's not actually true. I think when it comes to discipline is actually the skill of doing what you feel like, which is a weird definition because people will often say discipline is the ability to do the hard work when you don't feel like it. And that's true. It is the ability to do the hard work when you don't feel like it, but it is also the ability to do what you feel like. And the only difference between those definitions is we're talking about a different type of motivation when we say the word feel. When I say discipline is doing the hard work when you don't feel like it, I'm talking about short-term motivation. You don't feel like doing it in the short term. But when I say discipline is the ability to do the hard work when you sorry, when I say discipline is the ability to do what you feel like, I'm no longer talking about the short-term motivation. I'm talking about your long-term motivation, which you do want to achieve regardless of how you feel in the moment. So discipline is literally the skill of going towards what you want, what you genuinely feel like inside, not what you emotionally feel like right now. And yeah, if you can build discipline and you can actually learn to do the things that you don't feel like doing right now, you can overcome that asymmetry. Really, nothing is impossible because you'll constantly be improving and you'll constantly be grateful and you will achieve anything you want. So yeah, that is basically my opinion on all of that stuff. It's certainly not toxic to force yourself to do things that you don't emotionally feel like right now. You'd be surprised what you can take. And if you set yourself a long-term goal you actually want, you're not going to look back and regret doing it. You will always look back and be happy you made yourself do it. I've never in my entire life looked back at a time when I forced myself to go to the gym or forced myself to go for a run or forced myself to do this, that, things that I wanted in the long term. Zero. Never has it happened when I've looked back and gone, yeah, I wish I just hadn't have done that. I should have just slacked off, because I'm not that person anymore. I'm the future me who's grateful for the fact that I have that skill. So just a little video here. Hopefully that's useful for you guys and appreciate it.